The gavel comes down like a thunderclap, its cracks splitting the silence of courtroom 7 with cold, surgical finality. Behind the high mahogany bench, Judge Gary Russell leans back in his leather chair and allows himself a slow, satisfied smile. His pale blue eyes drift down to the man in the orange jumpsuit seated at the defense table. A black man, quiet, composed, hands folded in his lap, and Russell feels nothing. Not guilt, not hesitation, not even a flicker of doubt. To Gary Russell, the man in that jumpsuit is a ghost, a convenient nobody, a warm body to absorb a crime that could have destroyed everything he spent 23 years carefully building. His empire of backroom deals, rigged verdicts, and bought loyalty sits perfectly intact. His secret stays buried, and some random black man walking alone on the wrong street at the wrong hour is going to carry it to prison for him. That is what Judge Gary Russell believes. Sitting at the peak of his power, in the courtroom he has ruled like a private kingdom for over 2 decades. What Gary Russell does not know, cannot even begin to imagine, is that the man sitting in that orange jumpsuit staring calmly back at him is not a ghost. He is not a nobody. He is not a transient the system will silently swallow and forget. He is Edward Morgan, special agent in charge of the FBI's Federal Corruption Division. And for the past 18 months, Edward Morgan has been building an airtight, ironclad federal case, specifically against Judge Gary Russell. Every wiretap, every offshore account, every bribe, every buried verdict, every name in Russell's network, Morgan already has it. All of it, sealed in a 300-page federal indictment, sitting in a secure vault 12 blocks away, waiting for the signature of a federal judge. Gary Russell just threw the one man on earth with the power to destroy him into a cage. Pull up a chair, because the arrogance you're about to witness is going to be breathtaking, and the karma that follows it is going to be absolutely legendary. The night Gary Russell's empire began to crack open started like every other Tuesday in the affluent gated community of Pinecrest Hills. Quiet, manicured, and insulated from the kind of suffering Russell spent his days manufacturing inside a courtroom. Russell sat alone in his oak-paneled study, swirling 2 fingers of Blanton's bourbon in a crystal glass, the amber liquid catching the warm glow of the fireplace. For 23 years, the 9th District Municipal Court had been his personal kingdom. He decided who walked free and who rotted. He decided which cases got buried and which ones became headlines. He decided who paid the toll and who faced the full, merciless weight of a justice system he had hollowed out from the inside and stuffed with his own interests. He was untouchable. He had always been untouchable. Then his phone rang. It was his 24-year-old son, Connor. The moment Russell heard the breathing, shallow, panicked, drenched in the unmistakable slur of a man who had been drinking since noon, his grip tightened on the glass. "Dad," Connor's voice cracked. "Dad, I need you. Right now. I hit somebody. In the car. Near Delancey and 5th. She was on a bicycle, and I didn't see her. There was so much blood, Dad. I panicked. I drove away." Russell closed his eyes. The glass in his hand didn't shake. His voice didn't break. In 23 years of presiding over the worst moments of other people's lives, Gary Russell had never once lost his composure. He wasn't about to start now. "Where's the car?" Russell asked, his tone as flat and cold as a courtroom verdict. "Parked behind Kelleher's on 4th. I'm still inside it. Don't move. Don't speak. Don't touch your phone again until I call you back." Russell hung up and immediately dialed Detective Frank Doyle, his fixer, his enforcer, the man who had grown quietly wealthy, making Gary Russell's problems disappear for 15 years. "Frank, we have a situation." Russell laid it out in under 90 seconds. "Connor, the bicycle, the girl, the blood, the abandoned car." Doyle didn't hesitate. "I need a patsy," Russell said, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "Someone walking near the scene. Someone without connections. Someone the public defender's office will plea out before it ever sees a real courtroom. Find me someone the system won't fight for. There was a brief pause on the line. Consider it handled, Judge Doyle said. Gary Russell set down his bourbon, straightened his cufflinks, and returned to the fire. He had no idea he had just issued the order that would detonate his entire life. 12 blocks away, a man was walking calmly through the rain. The rain over Delancey and Fifth fell in cold, relentless sheets, the kind that empties sidewalks and drives honest people indoors. Detective Frank Doyle cruised slowly through the slick, near-empty streets in his unmarked cruiser, windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm, eyes scanning the darkness for exactly the kind of man Judge Russell had described. Someone without connections. Someone the system won't fight for. 2 blocks from the scene, Doyle found him. A black man in his late 40s, walking alone through the downpour. No umbrella. Dark jacket, collar turned up against the chill. Unhurried, unbothered. Moving through the rain with the quiet, measured calm of a man entirely at peace with himself. To Frank Doyle, squinting through the wet windshield, the man looked perfect. Out late, walking near a crime scene, fitting a profile that Doyle had exploited 100 times before, vague enough to be flexible, specific enough to sell to a jury. Doyle hit the lights. The cruiser screeched sideways across the wet asphalt, cutting off the man's path. Doyle was out of the vehicle in seconds, weapon drawn, voice barking into the rain. Hands, show me your hands right now. Down on the ground. Do it. The man stopped walking. He did not run. He did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at Doyle with a calm so absolute, so unervingly steady, that Doyle felt a brief, uncomfortable flicker of something he couldn't name. Then the man slowly raised both hands and lowered himself to the wet concrete with the controlled, deliberate movements of someone who had been trained to stay composed under extreme pressure. Name, Doyle demanded, pressing his knee into the man's back as the steel cuffs ratcheted tight. Edward, the man said quietly. His voice was deep and unhurried, completely devoid of fear. Doyle hauled him to his feet and shoved him toward the cruiser. He didn't check the man's pockets, didn't run his ID. He didn't want a name yet. He wanted a body in the system first, a narrative established before any inconvenient details complicated the story. What Doyle failed to notice, as he slammed the cruiser door shut, was the near-invisible wireless earpiece seated deep in Edward's left ear, or the micro-lens button camera stitched with precision into the lining of his jacket collar, transmitting a live encrypted feed to a secure server in a federal building 4 miles away. Edward Morgan, special agent in charge of the FBI's Federal Corruption Division, settled into the back of the squad car and allowed himself one slow, measured breath. He had been walking the perimeter of Doyle's precinct that night, conducting field reconnaissance for a federal raid already scheduled for the following month. He had not planned on being arrested, but as he listened to Doyle call Judge Russell to confirm the suspect was secured, Edward Morgan understood exactly what had just happened, and precisely what it meant. The judge hadn't just made a mistake. He had handed Edward the key to his own destruction. The holding cells beneath the 9th District Municipal Courthouse smelled of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and the particular brand of despair that settles into concrete walls after decades of broken men passing through them. Edward Morgan had spent 48 hours inside that system, observing its machinery with the quiet, methodical patience of a man who had dismantled far more dangerous operations than this one. He had given his name as Edward Mills, a generic placeholder offered flatly when processed, with the claim that his wallet had been lost. Detective Doyle, eager to rush the paperwork through before anyone asked inconvenient questions, had happily logged him as a John Doe transient and moved on. On the second morning, the iron door of the interview room swung open. A young woman entered, early 30s, carrying an overstuffed leather satchel and the particular exhaustion of someone running on courthouse coffee and sheer willpower. She dropped a thick manila folder onto the metal table and extended her hand. Mr. Mills, I am Lisa Carter. I've been assigned as your public defender. She sat down, opened the file, and looked at him directly. I'm going to be straight with you. They have you on felony hit and run, reckless endangerment, and fleeing the scene. Detective Doyle filed the report personally. He claims he observed you running from a vehicle. They also say they found the victim's blood on your jacket. Was the jacket logged into evidence immediately upon my arrest? Edward asked, his voice calm and precise. Lisa blinked. Most of her clients were either terrified or hostile. This man sounded like he was deposing a witness. It was logged at booking, yes. And has the chain of custody been unbroken since that point? She checked the file, hesitated. I need to verify that. Verify it, Edward said simply. And when you do, request the full GPS log from Doyle's precinct vehicle for the night of the arrest. Request it before Tuesday. Do not tell anyone you're requesting it. Lisa stared at him. Mr. Mills, I have to be honest with you. Judge Russell is presiding over your arraignment this afternoon. He is not. She chose her words carefully, known for leniency with defendants in your position. If we fight this and the blood evidence holds, you're looking at 15 to 20 years. A plea today could mean, I will not be entering a plea, Edward said, with the quiet finality of a man closing a door. Not guilty, and I want an expedited preliminary hearing to challenge the physical evidence. Lisa exhaled slowly. Russell will deny bail. You'll be remanded to county. I know, Edward replied. For the first time, the faintest trace of something, not quite a smile, but close, crossed his face. I'm counting on it. That afternoon, Courtroom 7 fell silent as the bailiff's voice cut through the air. All rise. The Honorable Gary Russell presiding. Russell swept in, robes billowing, and settled behind the high bench with the unhurried authority of a man who had never once doubted his own power. He picked up the docket without looking at the defense table. Case number 31 to 174. State versus Edward Mills. Felony hit and run. He finally glanced up, and for one fraction of a second, something shifted behind his pale blue eyes. The man at the defense table was not what he expected. The posture was too straight. The gaze too level. Too still. Russell pushed the feeling down immediately. Just a transient playing tough, he told himself. By Friday, he'll be begging for a plea. He slammed the gavel down. Bail denied. Defendant remanded to county. Preliminary hearing, Tuesday. Edward Morgan stood as the bailiff approached with the chains. Before turning, he looked directly at Judge Gary Russell and gave one single, almost imperceptible nod. Russell didn't understand what it meant. He would. Tuesday morning arrived gray and heavy over Atlanta, the sky the color of concrete, as though the city itself was bracing for what was about to happen inside Courtroom 7. The room was nearly empty. The bailiff, the court reporter, the ADA, a sharp-suited woman named Patricia Holt who owed her entire career to Gary Russell's political machine. Lisa Carter at the defense table, her leather satchel open, hands steady but eyes alert. And Edward Morgan, once again in an orange jumpsuit, wrists chained, seated beside her. What nobody in that courtroom noticed were the two men sitting quietly in the very last row of the gallery. Both in charcoal. My name is not Edward Mills, Edward said, rising slowly from his chair, his deep voice filling every corner of the room without effort. My name is Edward Morgan. I am a special agent in charge of the FBI's Federal Corruption Division. In your honor, his eyes locked onto Russell's with devastating calm. You just framed the man who's been building your federal indictment for the last 18 months. The courtroom erupted. From the back row, Agents Reyes and Brooks rose in unison, badges drawn, and pushed through the gallery gate with measured, unstoppable purpose. Doyle bolted from the witness stand toward the side exit and made it exactly 2 steps before Agent Brooks cleared the defense table in one motion and drove him hard into the polished hardwood floor, wrenching his arms behind his back with practiced precision. Frank Doyle. Federal arrest. conspiracy, evidence tampering, civil rights violations. At the defense table, Lisa Carter stood completely still, one hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide and bright with the dawning realization that she had just participated in something she would tell her grandchildren about. Agent Reyes approached Edward with a small silver key. 2 clean clicks. The chains fell from Edward Morgan's wrists and landed on the floor with a sound like a verdict being overturned. He rolled his shoulders once, straightened his spine, and walked slowly toward the bench where Gary Russell sat frozen, his gavel still gripped in both trembling hands. "Step down, Gary," Edward said quietly. "It's over." While Courtroom 7 descended into irreversible chaos, the city of Atlanta was about to discover that federal justice does not arrive politely. It does not knock. It does not negotiate. And on this particular morning, it was hitting every corner of Gary Russell's empire at exactly the same time. Edward Morgan had spent 18 months building this net. Every thread, every knot, every carefully calculated pressure point. And now, with one encrypted radio command transmitted from the Federal Operations Center on Peachtree Street, he pulled it tight. All of it, simultaneously, across the entire city. In the glass and marble luxury of Buckhead, 23-year-old Connor Russell was sprawled across a custom Italian leather sofa in his $2.8 million penthouse, nursing a hangover with a green juice and the morning news playing softly on his oversized wall-mounted television. His father had assured him, just 2 nights ago, that everything was handled. Some nameless black man had taken the fall. The problem was buried. Connor had already mentally filed the entire incident away and moved on, shielded by a lifetime of wealth and the unshakable belief that his father's reach was infinite. At exactly 9:07 a.m., his front door exploded off its hinges. The concussive breach sent splinters of reinforced oak across the gleaming marble foyer. Before Connor could process what was happening, a 12-man federal tactical team in full body armor flooded the living room, red laser sights cutting through the morning light and converging on his chest. "FBI, hands! Now, do not move," Connor screamed, hurling his green juice sideways and throwing both hands above his head, stumbling backward over his own coffee table. He hit the floor hard, scrambling on all fours before the lead agent hauled him upright by the collar of his silk pajamas and drove him face first against the floor-to-ceiling window. "It was my father," Connor sobbed before the cuffs were even fully closed around his wrists. "He made the call. He told Doyle to find someone. I just called him for help. I'll tell you everything. Please." The loyalty of a lifetime dissolved in under 10 seconds. Across the city, Detective Frank Doyle's apartment door came down at the same moment. Doyle, a man who had survived 15 years of dirty work through instinct and ruthlessness, made the catastrophic decision to run. He made it exactly 4 steps before 2 federal agents took him to the ground in the hallway outside his door, face down on the industrial carpet, arms wrenched behind his back. Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, Edward Morgan stood at the top of the marble steps, his dark navy suit immaculate, the cold morning wind moving through it as he watched the armored federal transport van carrying Gary Russell disappear into the snarl of downtown traffic. Russell had spent 23 years humiliating defendants on those same steps. Today, every camera in Atlanta had been watching him take the walk. Edward Morgan straightened his tie, pressed his earpiece once to confirm all units had executed, and allowed himself the quietest possible exhale. The net had closed perfectly. The interrogation rooms on the 3rd floor of the FBI's federal building on Peachtree Street were designed to be deeply uncomfortable. Fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that made the silence feel aggressive. The steel tables were bolted to the floor. The air carried the faint, metallic smell of anxiety and consequence. And on this particular morning, every single one of those rooms was occupied by a man who had spent years believing he was untouchable and was now discovering, with sickening clarity, exactly how wrong he had been. Frank Doyle broke first. He had lasted 4 hours. 4 hours of staring at the scuffed gray walls, listening to the distant sounds of the federal building processing the wreckage of Gary Russell's empire, before the accumulated weight of 15 years of buried evidence, manufactured testimonies, and orchestrated injustice finally became too heavy to carry alone. Agent Diana Reyes entered the room and placed a single photograph on the table without a word. It was a high-resolution surveillance image of Frank Doyle, taken 14 months ago outside a steakhouse in Midtown Atlanta, accepting a thick manila envelope from a known associate of the Marchetti organized crime family. Doyle's face in the photograph was relaxed, almost jovial. The face of a man who believed he was invisible. Doyle stared at it for a long time. "I want immunity," he said finally, his voice stripped of every trace of the swagger he had carried into every room for 15 years. His hands were trembling visibly around a paper cup of cold water. Agent Reyes leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. "You don't get immunity, Frank. You get a recommendation for leniency. And only if you don't waste my time." She tapped the photograph. The offshore accounts Russell used to route the kickbacks from the Marchetti family. Every account number. Every shell company name. Every transaction. She paused. And the sitting city councilman Russell was splitting the East Side rezoning bribes with. "Give me all of it, or I put you in the exact same federal facility as the 3 Marchetti lieutenants you helped Russell frame 4 years ago." Doyle's Adam's apple moved slowly in his throat. He looked at the mirrored glass on the far wall, knowing with absolute certainty who was standing on the other side of it. He took one long, defeated breath, and then he started talking. He talked for 3 hours and 14 minutes without stopping. He gave Reyes the offshore account numbers, 7 of them, spread across 4 countries under the names of 3 separate shell companies registered in Delaware. He detailed how Russell had systematically delivered favorable verdicts to the Marchetti family in exchange for untraceable campaign contributions laundered through a fake urban development charity. He explained the precise mechanics of how they had manipulated forensic evidence in at least 11 separate cases over the past decade. Then he gave them something nobody had expected. He told them about a secondary ledger, a physical book, handwritten, kept by Russell himself in a private safe deposit box at a First National branch in Savannah, containing the names of every judge, councilman, and state senator who had ever accepted a payment from Gary Russell's machine. Agent Reyes set her pen down slowly. The Doyle confession had just transformed a corruption case into a statewide earthquake. 2 floors above the interrogation room, Edward Morgan stood at the window of his temporary operations office, looking out over the Atlanta skyline. Agent Calvin Brooks appeared in the doorway behind him. "Doyle gave us everything," Brooks said quietly, "including the Savannah ledger." Edward didn't turn from the window immediately. He let the information settle with the patience of a man who had learned never to rush the moments that matter. "Get a team to Savannah tonight," he said finally, "and pull the full financial records on every name in that ledger before Russell's attorneys file for an injunction in the morning." He turned from the window, adjusted his cuffs, and picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. The walls just got a lot smaller for a lot of people. Connor Russell's world had collapsed to the dimensions of a 6x8 federal holding cell, and he had nobody to blame but the man who had spent a lifetime telling him nothing bad could ever touch him. Stripped of his designer clothes, his platinum watch, his Buckhead penthouse, and the bottomless financial cushion that had insulated him from every consequence of every reckless decision he had ever made, Connor sat on a concrete bunk and wept with the raw, graceless despair of someone encountering reality for the very first time. His high-priced defense attorney, a formidable litigator named Gerald Marsh, had tried every available angle to secure bail. The federal magistrate denied it without hesitation, citing Connor's proven flight risk, the severity of the victim's injuries, and the deliberate, calculated evidence tampering personally orchestrated by his father to protect him. Marsh sat across from Connor in the visitor's booth, separated by thick plexiglass, his expression carrying the particular coldness of a lawyer delivering news he is already emotionally detached from. Your father's assets are frozen under RICO statutes, Connor. Every account, every property, every investment, all of it locked. Marsh set down his legal pad. You're looking at a minimum of 12 years for the hit and run and vehicular assault. The only viable path remaining is full, unconditional cooperation. Connor pressed both palms flat against the plexiglass, his eyes red and swollen. I already told them everything. The moment they came through my door, I gave him all of it. His voice cracked. He told me it was handled. He said nobody would ever know. I believed him. The ultimate irony of Gary Russell's downfall was not that he had been caught. It was that the son he had incinerated his entire career to protect had surrendered him to federal agents before the handcuffs had fully closed around his wrists. But beneath the wreckage of the Russell empire, beneath the collapsing loyalties and the frozen assets and the cascading confessions, there was a far more important story unfolding. In a quiet room on the 4th floor of Grady Memorial Hospital, 22-year-old Maya Thornton, a third-year nursing student, had been fighting for her life for 11 days. The collision had shattered her left collarbone, fractured 4 ribs, caused a severe traumatic brain injury, and left her with internal bleeding that required emergency surgery within the first hour of her arrival. Her parents had not left the hospital. They had taken turns sleeping in the chair beside her bed, holding her hand, and praying with the quiet, exhausted faith of people who have nothing left to do but believe. On the 11th morning, Maya opened her eyes. When Edward Morgan walked into that hospital room 2 days later, he did not come as a federal agent. He came as the man who had briefly and willingly stood in the path of the machinery that had tried to erase her. He stood at the foot of her bed, his voice low and steady. We have him, Maya. Connor Russell, Frank Doyle, Gary Russell, every single one of them. They're never going to hurt anyone again. Maya could not speak easily through the wiring and the recovery, but her eyes found Edward's with a clarity and a depth that needed no translation. Slowly, she extended one trembling hand toward him. Edward stepped forward and held it gently, a quiet, unwitnessed promise between two people the system had tried to make invisible. He stood there for a long moment, saying nothing, feeling the full weight of why the work mattered. Then he straightened, nodded respectfully to her parents, and walked back out into the corridor. There was still work to finish. 6 months after the federal raid that tore the roof off the 9th District Municipal Court, the Thomas J. Hatch United States Courthouse in downtown Atlanta looked less like a judicial building and more like a military installation preparing for siege. Concrete barricades choked off 3 full city blocks around the perimeter. United States Marshals carrying patrol rifles stood at every public entrance, their expressions carved from stone. Above the Atlanta skyline, news helicopters from every major network carved slow, deliberate circles, their cameras trained on the courthouse steps where Gary Russell had once walked as an untouchable king and was about to enter as a federal inmate. Inside courtroom 14B, the atmosphere was suffocatingly still. The mahogany panel gallery was packed to absolute capacity. Federal agents, print journalists, and dozens of citizens who had spent years on the receiving end of Gary Russell's rigged gavel, many of whom had driven hours for the privilege of watching this particular morning unfold. At the defense table sat Gary Russell. He was unrecognizable. The commanding, immaculately groomed judge who had presided over the 9th District with imperial authority for 23 years had been replaced by something diminished and hollowed out. He had lost nearly 35 pounds. His once sharp silver hair had thinned dramatically, and his skin carried the translucent, grayish pallor of a man who had not seen natural sunlight in months. The tailored Italian suits were gone. In their place, the drab olive-green canvas jumpsuit of a maximum security federal inmate. A heavy steel belly chain wrapped tightly around his waist, connecting to the shackles clamped around his wrists and ankles. Every time the chains clinked against the wooden table, Russell flinched. Directly behind the prosecution table, in the very first row of the gallery, sat Edward Morgan. Dark navy suit. Immaculate posture. Expression unreadable. All rise. The Honorable Patricia Wynne swept into the room. A federal judge with 31 years on the bench and a documented, absolute zero tolerance for public corruption. She settled behind the high bench, adjusted her glasses, and opened the 280-page sentencing dossier Edward's team had compiled with surgical precision. She looked down at Gary Russell for a long, silent moment. "Harrison," she caught herself. "Mr. Russell." Her voice carried the particular coldness of someone who had chosen their words with great care and intended every single one of them to land. "I have spent the past 72 hours reviewing the documentation of your crimes. In 31 years on the federal bench, presiding over cartel operatives, organized crime leadership, and international fraud syndicates, I have rarely encountered conduct that represents such a comprehensive and deliberate desecration of the public trust as yours." Russell stared at the table. A single tear tracked silently down his face. "You converted a sacred institution of American justice into a private criminal enterprise." Gary Russell didn't lose because he got careless. He didn't lose because he got unlucky. He lost because of something far more fundamental than either of those things. He lost because absolute arrogance operates like a blindfold. It doesn't just obscure your vision. It convinces you that you don't need to see, that the rules governing every other human being on Earth simply do not apply to you, that the people you step on are beneath your notice, beneath your concern, and most critically, beneath your fear. That blindfold is what destroyed him. Think about the specific mechanics of how this unraveled. Gary Russell did not stumble into Edward Morgan by accident. He chose him, deliberately. He looked at a black man walking alone and quietly through the rain and made a series of rapid, prejudice-soaked calculations. That this man was nobody, that he was voiceless, that the system would absorb him without friction and forget him without consequence. That his blackness, his solitude, and his presence in that neighborhood at that hour made him the perfect ghost, someone society would swallow whole and never ask about again. Every single one of those calculations was not just wrong. They were catastrophically, cosmically, poetically wrong. Because the man Gary Russell looked at through the lens of his own deep-seated prejudice and dismissed as disposable was the precise individual who had spent the previous 18 months dismantling every brick of the empire Russell thought was indestructible. Edward Morgan didn't need to hunt Gary Russell down after being framed. He didn't need to fight the system from the outside, screaming for justice that powerful men could continue to ignore. Russell had personally gift-wrapped the opportunity and delivered it directly into Edward's hands. The trap didn't close on Gary Russell from the outside. He built it himself, brick by brick, decision by decision, assumption by assumption, and then he climbed inside it, pulled the door shut behind him, and handed Edward Morgan the key. That is the mechanism worth understanding. Not just that karma arrived, but specifically how it arrived. It rode in on the back of Russell's own arrogance. It used his prejudice as its vehicle. It weaponized his contempt for human beings he considered beneath him and turned that contempt into the instrument of his complete and total destruction. Edward Morgan never lost his composure, never raised his voice, never needed to, because the most powerful thing he did in this entire story was simply this. He stayed still, stayed silent, and allowed Gary Russell's arrogance to devour itself from the inside out. There's a lesson in that for every single one of us. The people you underestimate are not always who you think they are. The man you dismiss as a ghost might be the one holding the pen that writes the final chapter of your story. Gary Russell wrote his own, ending the moment. He said, "Find me someone nobody will miss." He just never imagined that someone would be the man who had already written his. If this story hit different for you, if you felt every single moment of that reckoning, then you already know what this channel is about. We find the stories where arrogance met its match, where the system tried to swallow the wrong person, and where karma showed up not with a whisper, but with a federal indictment and a one-way ticket to general population. Hit that follow button, because the next story is already waiting. And trust me, the karma drops even harder.